In the late fall of 1929, in the Mississippi Delta, the smell of wood smoke still lingered in the kitchen of a family whose father worked at a cotton gin. The screen door closed behind him with a familiar squeak. The tin lunch pail was set down on a wooden chair, worn smooth across the seat, while the weekly pay envelope rested quietly on the tabletop beside a white enamel mug chipped on one edge. The woman in the kitchen had not touched that money. She looked toward the wooden cupboard, a jar of bacon grease beside the stove, the remaining half-sack of cornmeal in the corner, and several bunches of collard greens freshly cut from the garden. Supper always began with whatever was already in front of her. Tonight, the recipe box would open one more card, opening the door to a Mississippi kitchen in 1929. In the late fall of 1929, in the Mississippi Delta, the screen door closed behind a cotton gin worker, while the smell of wood smoke still drifted through the small kitchen. The tin lunch pail was placed on a wooden chair, and the weekly pay envelope rested quietly on the table. The woman did not open it. She looked at the half-sack of cornmeal, the jar of bacon grease, several bunches of collard greens from the garden, and the remaining piece of salt pork. Supper always began with whatever the kitchen had managed to hold on to. The wooden recipe box, resting on the kitchen cupboard, carried the scent of aged wood and yellowed paper. Inside were recipe cards written in pencil, a few corners curled upward from steam, and even old receipts from the company store. She rarely read every line. Her hands remembered more than the paper could ever record. How much grease remained in the jar, whether the cast iron skillet was hot enough, or whether the garden had reached harvest season. Those things decided supper. That box still preserved countless meals from Southern working families, from a pot of greens costing less than 10 cents, to gravy poured over biscuits on days when the egg basket was empty, to stew made from the last cuts of meat at the butcher's counter. If kitchens like these still bring back any memories, stay with us as we open each recipe card still resting inside this box. Number 25 was salt pork collard greens. At the end of 1929, one pot of greens with a few slices of salt pork cost only about 8 to 12 cents, enough to feed 4 or 5 people. The woman picked each leaf, washed it several times in a galvanized wash basin, cut it into wide strips, then rendered the salt pork to collect the fat. Onion was sautéed until fragrant before the greens were added to the pot and simmered for nearly 1 hour. Every last drop of the pot liquor was always saved because it would help provide another meal. Number 24 was cast iron skillet cornbread. While the pot of greens continued to simmer, the cast iron skillet had already been preheated. One batch of cornbread cost only about 4 to 6 cents, made mostly from cornmeal, buttermilk, and a little bacon grease brushed across the skillet. The batter was mixed just enough, then poured onto the scorching hot cast iron. The edges turned golden brown, and the bottom made a crisp sound beneath the handle of a wooden spoon. The bread was broken into several pieces to dip into the hot pot liquor. In many Southern kitchens, just one skillet of cornbread and one steaming pot of greens were enough to bring a long workday to an end. After supper, the 2 remaining pieces of cornbread were wrapped in a cloth to be saved for the following morning. A jar of bacon grease was returned to its usual place, while the weekly pay envelope still rested in the corner of the table. By Saturday morning, the company store would open, and the next recipe cards would begin with the cuts of meat that few people chose. The weekly plate check, and the cuts of meat few people chose. On Saturday afternoon in 1930, in the Mississippi Delta, the wages of a cotton gin worker usually had to last the entire week before another paycheck arrived. By the time the company store had thinned out, the meat counter looked different. Attractive pork shoulders and pork bellies had already gone with the early shoppers. At the end of the counter remained a set of pork chitterlings, a few sections of neck bones, several strips of salt pork, neatly trimmed layers of fat resting on wax paper speckled with grease stains. The butcher recognized that woman. She usually came around this hour, opened her small coin purse, counted each coin, and quietly chose whatever could feed the whole family for longer than a single supper. Number 23 was slow-simmered pork chitterlings. In 1930, a set of pork chitterlings usually cost about 15 to 20 cents, far less than the pork shoulder that many people sought to buy. Once she arrived home, she carried a bucket of well water onto the back porch and washed the chitterlings with apple cider vinegar until the water became clearer. The onion was sliced thick. A small piece of salt pork was cut just enough to add flavor. Then everything was placed into the cast iron pot sitting on the wood-burning stove. Steam carried the scent of sweet onion and salt pork as it gradually spread throughout the room. The sound of the wooden spoon lightly touching the side of the pot blended with the steady crackling of the firewood beneath the stove. The stew simmered gently throughout the afternoon, allowing the broth to grow richer and each piece of chitterlings to become just tender enough. When supper was over, she ladled the remaining broth into a deep enamel bowl and placed it beside the window to cool. Tomorrow morning, that broth would still have another job to do. Number 22 was bacon grease hoe cake. On Sunday morning, the grease jar was opened before the remaining half sack of cornmeal was taken down from the shelf. She skimmed the layer of hardened grease from the surface of the previous night's broth, placed it into the cast iron skillet, and waited until the pan gave off a very gentle sizzle. A small pinch of cornmeal was dropped in to test the heat. When the edges of the meal turned golden brown, she pressed each flat cake onto the hot skillet. The aroma of toasted cornmeal mixed with bacon grease filled the entire kitchen. Half was placed on the supper table, while the other half was wrapped in wax paper and packed into the tin lunch pail to be carried during the new work week. By the time the company store closed its doors behind the last customers, the first tomatoes of the season had already begun to appear in the garden behind the house. In a few more weeks, that very garden would continue filling the recipe box with suppers preserved through each harvest season. Summer of 1931, when tomatoes ripen faster than hands could preserve them. During the summer of 1931, in the Mississippi Delta, the kitchen had already grown hot before noon. Glass jars, freshly rinsed with boiling water, sat upside down on a clean linen towel, while a basket of ripe red tomatoes beneath the table filled the air with a sweet aroma, mingling with the scent of vinegar and spices. Outside on the porch, several freshly cut watermelons still left beads of moisture on the wooden surface. The woman in the kitchen understood very well that summer waited for no one. But after only a few days of scorching sunshine, the finest produce from the garden would begin to change, and her hands had to move faster than the August heat. Number 21 was pickled watermelon rind. After the red flesh had all been divided, a child gathered the watermelon rinds to carry them out to the chicken coop before being called back. In 1931, its one jar of pickled watermelon rind cost only about 5 to 8 cents, made mostly from vinegar, sugar, and the few remaining spices left in the jar. The woman peeled away the green outer skin, kept the white rind, cut it into small squares, and soaked it in salt water. Afterward, the pieces were slowly cooked in a pot of sweetened vinegar until the edges of the rind became translucent, then neatly packed into still warm glass jars. The kitchen shelf, another jar of summer, had been preserved. Even the watermelon rind still had one final purpose before the sunny season passed. Number 20 was stewed tomatoes with stale bread. Beneath the table, several tomatoes with split skins had softened more quickly than expected. The woman cut away the bruised portions, placed each piece into a cast iron pot, and gently crushed them with a wooden spoon polished smooth by years of use. Slices of bread from the day before were torn by hand and dropped into the pot to absorb the tomato juices that were gently simmering. One pot cost only about 10 to 15 cents. When the tomatoes were picked just behind the house, and the bread was left over from the previous meal. The spoon stirred slowly as the aroma of ripe tomatoes blended with warm bread and filled the room. The old loaf found yet another day of purpose in the steaming pot of tomatoes. By the end of August, one corner of the kitchen shelf had gradually filled with glass jars. The jar of watermelon rind stood beside the jar of tomatoes, while a few final green fruits still lingered in the garden. As the first autumn breeze gently stirred the screen door, the kitchen quietly prepared to enter another season, where what needed preserving would no longer be what had just ripened, whatever remained at the end of the harvest that could still feed the family for many more meals. Late autumn, when nothing was laid to go to waste. In early October of 1931, the first seasonal winds slipped through the screen door of a Southern American kitchen, carrying the first chill after a long summer. The vegetable basket beneath the table was lighter than before, with a few potatoes resting beside several onions, while the slices of bread left from yesterday had gradually become stale on the wooden tray. On the kitchen shelf, the glass jars preserved during the summer had begun to replace the garden behind the house. Autumn always reminded the person standing at the stove that every remaining ingredient would have to complete its journey before winter came knocking. Number 19 was tomato gravy and biscuits. The woman opened a jar of tomatoes that had been preserved during the scorching days of summer instead of reaching for the hanging rack of meat. Around 1932, one pot of tomato gravy with biscuits cost only about 8 to 12 cents, made mostly from flour, bacon grease, and the reserved tomatoes. The grease was heated in a skillet, flour was stirred slowly until it turned golden, and then the tomatoes were added little by little. The wooden spoon continued stirring until the gravy thickened and coated the biscuits that had just come out of the oven. Rising steam carried the aroma of ripe tomatoes and bacon grease throughout the room. One jar of summer tomatoes once again brought warmth to an early chilly morning. Number 18 was pan-fried potatoes and onions. The woman gathered the small potatoes remaining at the bottom of the basket and arranged them neatly on the table. Around 1932, one skillet of potatoes and onions cost only about 10 to 14 cents, and often appeared when meat had become too expensive for many working families. The potatoes were sliced thin, the onions were cut into manageable pieces, and both were fried in a cast-iron skillet with the grease left over from the previous meal. The cast-iron lid was kept tightly closed during the first few minutes so the potatoes could become tender. Then it was lifted so each slice could turn golden brown and make a gentle, crisp sound when flipped over. The aroma of onions mingled with hot potatoes and quickly filled the kitchen. On some evenings, that alone was enough to bring the whole family together around the wooden table. The vegetable basket grew emptier with each passing day, while the jars on the shelf were opened one by one as each meal was prepared. Behind the house, the root cellar held only a few sacks of potatoes and a small supply of cornmeal that had been carefully stored. Winter was drawing near, and from this point on, the kitchen would live on everything the family had patiently saved throughout each season of the year. Winter arrives. Every stew had to last one more day. The winter of 1932 arrived early in the American South. From the break of dawn, heat rose from the cast-iron pot resting in the center of the stove, fogging the window overlooking the cotton fields that had just been harvested. The jars of tomatoes, pickled vegetables, and beans, preserved during the summer, were brought down from the shelf one by one. A pure cloth sack of white beans had grown lighter after many weeks of cold weather. In that kitchen, the first thing always taken into account was tomorrow morning's breakfast, even before tonight's supper had been cleared from the table. Number 17 was white bean soup. The woman poured the last handful of white beans from the cloth sack into an enamel basin and soaked them overnight before transferring them to the cast-iron pot. Around 1932, one pot of white bean soup cost only about 12 to 18 cents, enough to feed 4 to 5 people gathered around the table. The beans simmered for many hours with a marrow bone and a small piece of salt pork. The foam that rose to the surface was carefully skimmed away before salt and pepper were added near the end of the cooking. The aroma of cooked beans blended with the broth and spread throughout the house, while the remaining soup stayed in the pot until the following morning. People often said that a pot of beans always tasted richer after resting quietly on the stove overnight. Number 16 was cornbread in milk. Leftover cornbread from the previous supper was broken into small pieces in a white enamel bowl with a worn rim. A little fresh milk, or the remaining buttermilk from the stoneware jug, slowly poured over the top and left for a few minutes until the cornbread softened. Around 1932, a bowl like this cost only about 6 to 10 cents. That simple breakfast accompanied many people to the fields and to the factories throughout the long winters. Last night's cornbread once again marked the beginning of a new day. Number 15 was fried salt pork. The woman sliced the salt pork so thin that the light coming through the window was almost able to pass through it. A portion of meat costing about 10 to 15 cents rarely occupied an entire plate by itself. Slices were fried slowly to render the fat, and that fat was then used to flavor skillets of potatoes and vegetables, while the meat itself was divided into many small portions around the supper table. Just one thin slice of meat was enough to transform the flavor of an entire pot of food. The jar of bacon grease had nearly reached the bottom, and the sack of beans held only the last few scattered handfuls. Outside, the winter wind continued sweeping across the fields, stripped of their cotton stalks. The woman closed the lid of the cast-iron pot, looked at the row of jars on the kitchen shelf, and quietly prepared for the cold months still ahead. From this point on, the kitchen would continue to live on the careful thrift of an entire year, and every meal would preserve far more than just the warmth inside that little house. The meals born from what was left behind. At the beginning of 1933, in the American South, the cast-iron skillet remained on the stove from the first light of dawn until the oil lamp was lit. Before opening the sack of flour or taking more ingredients from the wooden cupboard, the woman always lifted the lid from the previous evening's pot. She looked at what remained, measured it with her eyes, and then decided what the next meal would be. In that kitchen, food carried over from one day to the next, just as the fire in the stove never truly went out throughout the winter. Number 14 was fried cornbread crumbles. The cornbread, hardened after 2 days, but still kept in the cloth towel beside the jar of bacon grease. Around 1933, one skillet of fried cornbread crumbles cost only about 4 to 6 cents because it required almost no new ingredients. The woman crumbled the cornbread into small pieces, mixed it with a little of the remaining bacon grease, and spread it evenly across the hot cast-iron skillet. The sound of the crumbs crisping into a golden brown blended with the aroma of toasted cornmeal filling the entire room. The cornbread from 2 days earlier returned to the table in a different form. Number 13 was potato cakes. The leftover mashed potatoes from supper were placed in the middle of the table instead of being stored away in the corner of the kitchen. Around 1933, one batch of potato cakes cost only about 6 to 9 cents, making use of the mashed potatoes and a small amount of flour remaining in the sack. The potatoes were mixed well, shaped into flat cakes, and pan-fried in a thin layer of grease. The woman turned each cake over when the underside had become evenly golden, and the edges had just begun to turn crisp. Yesterday's bowl of mashed potatoes was once again enough to begin another meal. Number 12 was bread pudding. The loaf of bread had become so dry that even a knife could hardly slice it, so it was torn into small pieces by hand and soaked in milk inside a deep enamel bowl. Around 1933, one pan of bread pudding cost only about 10 to 14 cents, with a little sugar and a few eggs added whenever the household still had enough. The mixture was poured into a baking pan and baked slowly until the top turned golden brown and released the aroma of milk blended with toasted bread. The old loaf completed its journey by becoming a new dessert. The recipe box was placed back onto the wooden shelf, while several scraps of paper describing ways to make use of leftover food remained neatly inside. Winter still stretched on, and every ingredient in that kitchen continued to be given one more chance before making way for the spring that was arriving ever so slowly. A single cast-iron skillet had to feed the whole family. In the spring of 1934, in the American South, the cast-iron skillet was still warm after breakfast, as it was quickly wiped with a clean cloth and placed back on the stove. A thin layer of grease still clinging to the surface of the skillet preserved the flavors of previous meals, waiting until the fire was lit once again. In that kitchen, a single cast-iron skillet carried the family from dawn until late afternoon, preparing every meal without needing more ingredients than what remained on the wooden shelf. Number 11 was fried cabbage with salt pork. One head of cabbage was cut into quarters on a chopping board marked by countless knife scars. Around 1934, one skillet of fried cabbage with salt pork cost only about 12 to 16 cents, enough to feed 4 people gathered around the table. The woman first fried a few slices of salt pork to render the fat, then sliced the cabbage into long strips and stirred it across the hot skillet. Rising steam carried the aroma of cabbage, blended with the savory flavor of the meat, while each strand of cabbage became just tender enough, yet still retained a slight crispness. Just a little rendered pork fat was enough to completely transform the flavor of the entire skillet of cabbage. Number 10 was skillet corn. The kernels that had been cut from the cobs earlier that morning were poured into the still hot skillet. Around 1934, one skillet of corn like this cost only about 8 to 12 cents, made mostly from corn with a little butter or bacon grease. The woman stirred it over medium heat and seasoned it with salt and pepper just before removing the skillet from the stove. The gentle popping of the corn blended with the aroma of sweet corn roasting on the hot cast iron and quickly filled the room, signaling that supper was ready. Number 9 was onion gravy. Only a few onions and a little flour remained in the basket. Around 1934, one pot of onion gravy cost only about 5 to 8 cents and often appeared on days when there was no meat left to cook. Onions were sliced thin and cooked very slowly until they turned golden brown and released their natural sweetness. Then they were stirred together with flour and broth to create a rich, thick gravy. That gravy was poured over hot biscuits or cornbread, creating a simple yet satisfying meal. On some days, the sweetness of onions took the place of an entire piece of meat. After supper, the cast iron skillet held its warmth for quite some time, while the food basket grew lighter with each passing day of spring. Outside, the garden rows had already begun to be turned over in preparation for the new planting season. The kitchen also waited quietly for the next harvest. The year's first ingredients would once again return to the familiar wooden table. The meals from when meat was no longer the most important thing. Around 1935, in the American South, a sack of dried beans usually remained in the kitchen far longer than any cut of meat brought home from the store. On the wooden shelf were still cornmeal, several jars of pickled vegetables, and bags of seeds saved for the next planting season, while the salt pork was sliced thinner with each passing week. The woman standing by the stove understood that the number of slices of meat did not measure a satisfying supper on the table, but by making sure every bowl was filled before the oil lamp was lit. Number 8 was pinto beans with cornbread. The handful of pinto beans that had been soaked since the previous evening was poured into a cast iron pot with a small piece of salt pork for flavor. Around 1935, one pot of beans served with cornbread cost only about 15 to 20 cents, enough to feed 4 to 5 people. The beans simmered for many hours until they became tender, while the freshly baked cornbread was broken into pieces for dipping into the steaming bean broth. The aroma of beans blended with hot cornmeal filled the entire kitchen. A hot pot of beans was always enough to warm the whole house through the long days. Number 7 was turnip greens. The bunches of turnip greens freshly cut from the garden were carried straight to the enamel basin, washed several times, and cut into sections before being placed into the pot. Around 1935, one pot of greens like this cost only about 8 to 12 cents when the vegetables were grown just behind the house. A small amount of salt pork was added for flavor, and everything was simmered until the broth turned a deep green. As long as the pot of greens remained hot, supper was still enough to bring the whole family together around the table. Number 6 was black-eyed peas. The sack of black-eyed peas was taken down from the shelf at the back of the kitchen, where dry ingredients were always carefully stored from season to season. Around 1935, one pot of black-eyed peas cost only about 10 to 15 cents. The peas were simmered until tender with onions and a spoonful of bacon grease to give the broth a richer flavor. The aroma of sweet onions blended with the steam rising from the hot peas and slowly spread throughout the room. Some ingredients were remarkably simple, yet they remained on the table throughout the entire year. The sack of beans beneath the table had grown lighter after many suppers, but the cornmeal and the jars of vegetables on the shelf were still enough for the days ahead. The woman closed the lid of the cast iron pot, looked at the garden turning green again outside the window, and knew that the kitchen still held many more stories, preserved through every meal and every card inside the recipe box. The final meals that kept smoke rising from the kitchen. At the beginning of 1936, in the American South, the recipe box still rested on the corner of the kitchen cupboard, but what remained on the kitchen shelves had become much scarcer. A few jars of preserved food from the summer, a small sack of beans, and a nearly empty sack of cornmeal quietly waited for supper. The woman opened each jar, looked over the remaining ingredients, and then lit the fire beneath the familiar cast iron skillet. What had been preserved throughout those years had never been only the food, but the steady plume of smoke that continued to rise each evening from the little kitchen. Number 5 was navy beans on toast. The pot of white beans left over from the previous evening was placed back on the stove and reheated very slowly until the broth was evenly hot. Around 1936, one serving of navy beans over toast cost only about 10 to 14 cents, making use of the leftover bean stew and a few remaining slices of bread. Bread was toasted on the surface of the cast iron skillet and placed on a plate before the hot beans were ladled over the top. Rising steam carried the aroma of beans blended with the scent of toasted bread throughout the room. Once again, a single slice of bread created another supper from the very same pot of beans cooked the day before. Number 4 was biscuits and sorghum syrup. The jar of sorghum syrup was opened very slowly, pouring only a thin stream across the tops of the freshly baked biscuits. Around 1936, one batch of biscuits with sorghum syrup cost only about 8 to 12 cents. The biscuits were broken open while they still held their warmth, allowing the amber-colored syrup to slowly soak into every soft crumb. Just one thin layer of syrup was enough to make the meal feel richer during the days when ingredients had nearly run out. Number 3 was cornmeal mush. The sack of cornmeal was carefully folded closed after the last portion had been poured into a pot of boiling water. One pot of cornmeal mush cost only about 5 to 8 cents and was a familiar meal for many working families in 1936. The cornmeal was stirred continuously until it became thick. One portion was served immediately while still hot, and the remainder was left to cool before being sliced and fried the following morning. That small sack of cornmeal had kept the kitchen fire burning through countless cold days. The recipe box now held only a few cards that had not yet been turned over. The jar of bacon grease had nearly reached the bottom. The sack of cornmeal held only a thin layer across its base. The woman placed the cast iron skillet back in its familiar place on the stove. only one final card remained inside the box. It held the meal, remembered longer than any other in the kitchen, that had carried the whole family through those difficult years. They were not just 30 ways to keep the kitchen light burning. At the end of 1936, in the American South, the recipe box was opened to reveal one final card. The cast iron skillet had gradually cooled after supper, its warmth still lingering on the stovetop, while the jar of bacon grease remained in its familiar place beside the wooden spoon, polished smooth through many years of use. Beyond the screen door, a winter wind swept across the cotton field that had already been harvested, while inside the kitchen, the lamplight still fell across the table where the whole family had just risen after the meal. That kitchen was quieter than it had been at the beginning of the story, yet its warmth still lingered in every bowl that had just been set down. Number 2 was buttermilk cornbread. The woman broke the last cornbread of the day into equal portions and passed them around the table. Around 1936, one batch cost only about 8 to 12 cents, made from cornmeal, buttermilk, and a thin coating of bacon grease brushed across the cast iron skillet that had already been preheated. The batter was mixed just enough, poured onto the hot cast iron, and baked until the crust turned golden brown. The aroma of cornmeal filled the room. Some kitchens always felt abundant as long as a skillet of freshly baked cornbread still rested on the table. Number 1 was beans and cornbread. A pot of beans was placed back in the center of the table one more time before the fire beneath the stove slowly died down. Around 1936, one pot of beans with cornbread cost only about 15 to 20 cents, but it was enough to feed the whole family through several meals. The beans had been soaked since the morning, simmered for many hours, and then ladled into individual bowls, while the hot cornbread was broken into small pieces for dipping into the thick bean broth. The remaining portion was left in the pot for breakfast the following morning. That humble meal became the supper that appeared most often on the wooden tables of countless Southern working families. The 30 meals had come to an end. What remained was never the number of spoonfuls of flour or the hours spent simmering in the cast iron pot. What remained were the memories of afternoons when the weekly wages had just been placed on the table, a tin lunch pail waiting to be carried away at first light, and the hands that always knew how to make do so. The kitchen would never be without smoke rising from the stove. The woman gently smoothed the final recipe card before placing it back inside the well-worn recipe box with its frayed corners. The lid closed very softly, just as it had when the story began. If your family's kitchen once had a cast iron skillet, a tin lunch pail, or a meal that has been remembered through the years, leave that story in the comments below. Perhaps someday, memory will become the next card placed inside the recipe box, allowing this journey to be opened once again.